This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Thank you, Anne, Randy, and everybody for the invitation. It's great to be here. These are my Mardi Gras beads because I'm missing Mardi Gras back home, but I heard that the weather is even worse than here. So, and there's a reason I'm wearing these right now, actually, aside from missing New Orleans. I wanted to start with a thought about festivals. I don't know if any of you have heard. I love this topic, and I think what you people are doing with from what I've understood, the sequence of talks about the good life, in my opinion, you're on to the most important question, and it's great to participate in it. I thought I would start. I don't know if you've come upon an anecdote about the philosopher Pythagoras about the good life. No? Pythagoras was apparently, he's a legendary figure. We don't really know anything historically. But he was once asked, he called himself a philosopher. And, people asked him, what does that mean? What is a philosopher? And to explain it, he compared life to a festival. So he said, at a festival like the Olympic Games in Greece, some people go to compete. They want to win a victory. Some people go to sell hot dogs. But some people go and to make a profit out of the festival. But some people go just to contemplate. And the word he used, which maybe you've been introduced to, theoria, obviously the root of our word theory, is the notion of contemplation. Pythagoras said, that's the life of the philosopher. The whole Western tradition you could look at, to what extent did philosophers agree with him about that? Of course, there's huge debate about that. But I think it's a very neat story that I believe Aristotle must have in the back of his mind in the beginning of the Ethics, in the passage I've handed out to all of you. So I know some of you have been reading the Ethics, maybe not everybody. If you don't have time to read that now, take it home afterwards and read it again and think about it. But Aristotle also is raising the question, is there some kind of life that's better than another? And I think he's got this model in mind. So let me begin. Aristotle's Ethics addresses a question of the greatest importance for all of us. What is the good life for a human being? What is the life that brings happiness? That's eudaimonia in Greek. We might need that. So, this is presumably something everyone would want to know. But what might seem highly questionable to us is the notion that there is some objective measure of the good for a human being as such. Isn't it just whatever pleases us that counts as happiness? Or is it possible that eudaimonia, which maybe is better translated as flourishing or faring well, is not just a matter of individual preference? Could there be some particular way of life that above all others most completely or perfectly fulfills the natural potential of a human being as such, and would thus count as the human good? In Book 1, Chapter 5 of the Ethics, which is what you have in your hands, Aristotle examines a set of contestants to the title of the best life for a human being. He responds to each claim very quickly, without much, if any, real argument in support. But if you look carefully at these responses, and you consider how each is developed in the course of the Ethics as a whole, this seemingly very simple discussion proves to be a rich source for understanding the work as a whole. That's what I would like to explore with you today. And even after many years of working on this book, I discovered in putting these thoughts together in this form, it's much harder than it seems. The first question is what exactly we mean in speaking of a way of life. What defines a way of life, according to Aristotle, and differentiates one from another, is the final end or the goal toward which it is directed, the telos in Greek. Everything we do deliberately, every action, aims at some end, Aristotle argues. But if each end is for the sake of something else, so you go out of the room to get a breath of fresh air, you want to get a breath of fresh air to stay healthy, you want to stay healthy for something else, If the chain went on ad infinitum, Aristotle reasons, every step would be empty and in vain. So the human good we are seeking, which would be the most complete actualization of a potential that belongs to us as human beings, is a final end. It's not just something we make in a process of production, not the product at the end of that process. It is rather an activity. Got to give you another Greek word, very important. In Aristotle's language, it's an energia. I hope you hear the root of the word energy in there. An activity, an energia, is something that's complete at every moment. Just an aside, so I hope you're on my wavelength here. In one place, he compares the difference between making a flute. There's a process, first you get the metal and so forth, you go through the process of making it, and then the telos is the flute at the end, which is outside of the whole process. That's not what he means by an energia or an activity. Playing a flute would be an energia. You're just playing. You're not on the step of a process to an external product. So this activity that counts as the human good cannot be instrumental. It must be something desirable for its own sake. But let me be more precise. Aristotle doesn't really take it for granted that there is such a final end. In a way, that's one of the deepest questions he actually raises. He only argues that if there were, discovering it would be as important for us as having a target is for archers. How do we even begin such an inquiry? That's a philosophic problem that may be familiar to some of you from Plato's Meno. If we don't even know what we're looking for, how would we even set out on a search? And how would we even recognize what we were seeking if we came upon it? If, on the other hand, we did know, why would we need to inquire in the first place? Either way, we seem to be stymied. Aristotle offers a solution to this problem, but in fact, it appears only to highlight the paradox. We must begin, of course, with what's first. But we don't really know what's first or primary in itself. We have to begin with what's first for us. And that means whatever assumptions and opinions we already hold. In the case of the ethics, the inquiry is accessible only to those who have been brought up and guided by the proper opinions that something is noble or just. That's in chapter 4 of your handout if you look back at it later. You have to have been brought up with these opinions that something is beautiful or noble or just. And Aristotle continues, if the that is sufficient, there would be no need to look for the why. I think most readers of the ethics take that fairly straightforward. But after thinking about it, or after reading it and accepting it for a long time, it suddenly dawned on me what a crazy idea this is. So what many people think is, the ethics is addressed to the gentlemen who do not question whether the things that they hold noble and just are worth pursuing. But in that case, those who have satisfied the condition required to participate in this project would have no need to pursue it. On the other hand, those who do need to pursue it wouldn't have what is required to do so. Are you all with me here? If the that, you need the that to participate. But if you have the that and it's satisfactory, you don't need the why. Why would you read the ethics? The ethics looks like a book for no one. Perhaps we can draw a different conclusion from Aristotle's puzzle. Let us grant that we must begin with the opinions of our own society about what is noble or shameful, just or unjust. But those opinions, as Aristotle remarks, are so variable from one place or time to another that they're sometimes thought to be entirely by convention. Nothing is noble or just by nature. Now, isn't it precisely someone who had become aware of that problem for whom the inquiry of the ethics would be of the greatest need? Shouldn't it be addressed above all to someone who is beginning to wonder whether the things said to be noble and just are truly good for a human being and are really the way to happiness? Perhaps, in fact, the ethics doesn't just await a reader with that dissatisfaction, but aims to awaken it. To do that, it would have to bring to light all of the limitations, the partial perspectives, the internal contradictions of the opinions with which its readers begin. Of course, if Aristotle were responsible, he would have to try to disturb as little as possible those who are satisfied with the that of their moral education. Can his inquiry do that while inducing the perplexities that would provoke a search for the why in the appropriate audience? Reading the ethics with that challenge in mind is, I believe, the key to understanding this very thought-provoking work. 3 lives. The most fundamental opinion, which is the premise of the whole inquiry, according to Aristotle, is a nearly universal agreement. Almost everyone believes the final end in human life is happiness, or faring well, or flourishing. Everything else we desire is ultimately for the sake of happiness, but we never desire happiness for the sake of something else. This common agreement, however, is the basis for the greatest dispute about what constitutes this happiness or eudaimonia. What is it? What does it consist in? Not only do different individuals disagree, the same individual disagrees with himself at different times. When you're sick, health seems to be the final end. When you're impoverished, wealth seems so, and so on. Given the vast array of claims about happiness, examining them all might seem like an impossible task. Aristotle warns that in matters like these, one must look not just at what people say, but at how they act. On that basis, he finds a very limited set of opinions that are dominant in his society, and I would say in ours as well. More precisely, in this chapter 5 that you're holding, Aristotle takes up for examination 3, and actually it turns out to be 4, popular views. I'll be very curious afterwards to hear what you think about this selection. You know, at first it seemed to me completely arbitrary. Then the more I thought about it, it seemed like maybe this is very comprehensive. But I wonder, are there other candidates that you would propose? Is he missing something important? Aristotle begins by distinguishing the view of the many and the most vulgar from the more refined and the active. The reference to the most vulgar might seem to have a tone of contempt, but it is the voice, as we eventually realize, not of Aristotle, but of the more refined, the gentlemen, who have some grounds, perhaps, for looking down on the multitude, whom they see identifying the good or the final end with pleasure and embracing the life of enjoyment devoted to it. In the eyes of the more refined, the best for a human being is the political life, or the life of action, which looks to honor as its end. Echoing the Pythagorean model I mentioned, Aristotle introduces a third, the life of contemplation, or the theoretical life, though he gives us no indication of what the final end is toward which that life is oriented. That omission actually raises a very difficult question. How exactly is a way of life defined by its final end? Does this, what Aristotle calls the life of enjoyment, require that every moment be filled with pleasure? Is there no enjoyment in the life of action or the theoretical life, which are supposed to be altogether other? See, I'm suggesting, it sounded so simple, 3 lives. Already when you ask that question, I think you realize it's not so easy to even understand how he's separating out these lives and what the relation is to the end that's supposed to define them. Aristotle is not prepared to address these issues in a rapid sequence of responses he now offers to the claims under consideration. The first contestant, the life of enjoyment, which finds the human good in pleasure, is rejected with nothing but the disdainful remark that the many appear utterly slavish in choosing a life for cattle, a life fit for cows. Now, this is not completely unreasonable. If pleasure motivates all animals, it looks as if it cannot play the role of the distinctively human good. But the objection raises none of the questions it should about the nature of pleasure. It reflects once again the perspective of the gentleman in its strength and in its limits. In contrast to the private life of enjoyment, the political life they advocate should be devoted, you might think, to the good for the community. For Aristotle, that would be the polis, or the city. But what we're concerned with now, don't forget, is the good for the individual. And the end sought by an individual who lives a political life, Aristotle maintains, is honor. Honor, however, is given by others. One who desires honor is dependent on those who bestow it, whereas the good is divined, as Aristotle puts it, to be something more self-sufficient. It is especially problematic if those who consider themselves superior depend on honor from the many whom they take to be living lives no better than cattle. Aristotle does not for the moment pursue this deep-rooted problem. Instead, he goes on to acknowledge that those who seek honor are not really looking just for fame or recognition, but more specifically, for recognition of their excellence. The final end of the political life, then, would not be honor, but virtue. Of course, what he's really implied is the reputation for virtue. With a rather cryptic observation, Aristotle quickly eliminates the claim of virtue to count as the human good. Virtue, he says, is too incomplete. You don't really know. It's very problematic. What does he mean, it's too incomplete? To be the final end that we are looking for. It's possible, he says, after all, to have a virtuous disposition while you're asleep, without ever putting it into practice, in the midst of suffering great misfortune, which no one would call a happy life. That, again, seems like a sensible point, but it's not obvious to me why it should be a specific rejection of the claim of virtue to count as the human good. Turning to the third contestant, the theoretical life, Aristotle only comments that he'll get back to it later, which turns out to mean not until the 10th and last book of the Ethics. You've got a long stretch before he gets to solving his question here. For the moment, he suddenly adds a fourth, unannounced candidate, the life of money-making. This would not constitute another way of life unless the production of wealth were pursued as an end in itself. But accumulating wealth, it is assumed, is properly understood only as a means. Again, the instrumental status of money is perhaps a persuasive ground for rejecting its claim to be, objectively, the final end in human life. Yet, I'm still wondering, why has Aristotle gone out of his way to introduce it? He already had the three lives. Why add this? And it seems to me he asks us to remember that wealth is the necessary condition for all the ways of life under consideration. None of these ways of life is perhaps as self-sufficient as it might claim or want to be. Now, Aristotle's survey has eliminated all but one contender to the title of the best human life, and that one has simply been left in question. Pleasure was rejected as a final end on the unexamined assumption that it is all of one sort, which makes the many, I'm going to try to emphasize what I'm pulling out of the text here, appear slavish, he says, in choosing a life common to all animals. Honor is rejected because it is thought to depend on all others, while we have divined that the good should be self-sufficient. Virtue appears inadequate because it is thought possible to have it in a state no one would call happy. Basically, every phrase of this argument is a matter of opinion. We have been examining a set of opinions about what constitutes human happiness on the basis of a set of opinions about the standards to be met. What we have discovered thus far is that the most common candidates do not live up to the criteria assumed for what counts as happiness. To think through what has been so quickly assumed in each case would require following the fate of each of these candidates as you trace a path through the argument of the ethics as a whole. Perhaps we can try to catch just a glimpse of that today. I hope you'll all continue and do this. It's amazing. I think it is true that this little chapter, you've got it in half a page, contains almost all the threads of the argument of the whole ethics, which is probably one of, maybe the most influential book in moral and political philosophy in the Western tradition. So he's got off to a strong start here, but I would hope I'm conveying how questionable each of the moves is so far. Okay, let's start with pleasure and the life of enjoyment. Pleasure, we just saw, is rejected as a life fit for cattle. It would be rather shocking then if we jumped directly to Book 10, which opens with a sharp criticism of just such an unqualified teaching. In matters like these, Aristotle advises once again, speeches are less persuasive than deeds. And someone who unqualifiedly condemns pleasure is absolutely bound to be seen at some point in his life inclining toward pleasure of some sort. Then people will reject his speeches just as unqualifiedly. Surely Aristotle must have been aware of this sensible point when he expressed in Book 1 the contemptuous dismissal of pleasure as such. That condemnation, he now confirms, expressed the perspective of the gentleman, and the action of the ethics, the action of the argument of the work, consists in moving its reader, or a certain kind of reader, from that starting point beyond it. In correcting the initial rejection of pleasure, the argument of the ethics goes through more reversals and revisions, I believe, than on any other topic. Most conspicuously, Book 10 introduces its discussion of pleasure with the remark that this is far too important an issue to ignore. After the question of the nature and the good of pleasure was the subject of an extended analysis in Book 7. These reversals and revisions in the treatment of pleasure are usually taken as the most obvious sign that the ethics is not very carefully composed. Aristotle didn't deliberately put this together. Maybe it's just a compilation of notes. That's a common view. I would argue, on the contrary, that the developments in the understanding of pleasure are particularly illuminating signposts of the argument that makes the work a whole. As soon as the inquiry turns in Book 2 to moral virtue and the formation of character, it is immediately necessary to recognize the powerful role that pleasure and pain play in our lives. The gentleman may indignantly reject pleasure as the human good, but he would not have developed the virtues he is proud of and avoided the vices he disdains had he not been trained from childhood to take pleasure in the one sort of action and find the other painful. Virtue of character, on Aristotle's account, is acquired by habituation, practicing the appropriate actions to develop the desired disposition. If you want to become a piano player, you have to practice playing piano. And the tool of moral habituation is the natural attraction to pleasure or aversion to pain. Pleasure and pain, which motivate all animals, are flexible enough in human beings to be channeled in the directions we find desirable. That possibility rests, for one thing, on our political nature. We need to live together with others and can't help but find pleasure in their approval, pain in their disapproval. So, for instance, to foster the virtue of moderation, a parent has to try to habituate his child to give up the immediate pleasure of eating candy for dinner or something and get pleasure in being praised for eating broccoli. and pleasure in the sense of self-control he develops, which will then bring further praise. But you're really substituting one form of pleasure or pain for another. The morally virtuous person, we will learn, is supposed to choose his action entirely for its own sake, simply because it is beautiful or noble in itself. You might want to ask me later when I say beautiful or noble. We can talk about that later. But if he has developed this disposition by being brought up to take pleasure in the appropriate actions and find the inappropriate ones painful, wouldn't that continue to motivate his action? Or at least make it hard to know his own motives? To separate out this life of enjoyment as one fit for cattle is to assume that all pleasure is of one kind, the kind human beings share with other animals. In fact, however, pleasure accompanies all sorts of activities. A pig rolls in the mud with pleasure. You guys study Aristotle's Ethics with pleasure. You will eventually. Are the pleasures that accompany different activities themselves different in kind? Are there kinds of pleasure? Or is there just some one thing, pleasure itself, however different the activities might be that lead to it? This turns out to be, in books 7 and 10, a very challenging question. By the time that kind of question is raised, the perspective of the gentleman has been left behind. Just how far the argument moves from its initial starting point is vividly evident in Book 7, which first takes up this challenging theoretical question, what is pleasure, when you think about it? And stand back from moral judgment. What is pleasure is a perplexing issue. The investigation Aristotle conducts leads to a very far-reaching conclusion. If all animals, human beings down on down, if all animals aim at pleasure in one way or another, pleasure would appear to be the good for living things. Of course, Aristotle grants it's not one and the same pleasure that all animals seek, or, he pulls back, or maybe pleasure is some one end for all living beings. And he has this interesting cryptic phrase there, for nature has implanted something divine in life, in living things. I mean, I don't think people see how close Aristotle has come, I think, there to giving voice to what philosophers would call a thesis of hedonism. This radical speculation may explain the need to return to the topic of pleasure at the beginning of Book 10, to ask again whether there are any pleasures that are distinctively human. As Aristotle argues there, for any living thing, I think the way you really have to put it is for any animal, because I don't think this applies all the way to plants, but for any living animal, to be alive most fully is to be aware. For other animals, that's through perception. For human animals, that's through perception and thinking. Those are our modalities for awareness. And when such awareness is in its best condition, the experience that accompanies it is pleasure. That's how he's defining pleasure at that point. It follows along with this experience of being aware, which is what it is to be alive. Pleasure and life are inextricably bound together. Indeed, Aristotle finds it impossible to answer the question he poses, whether we live for the sake of pleasure or we experience pleasure for the sake of life. In fact, as we finally hear, and we'll get back to this in a minute in Book 10, the very special pleasure that comes with the activity in which human beings are most fully awake and thus most fully alive is one measure of what makes the life devoted to that activity best. So you've come a long way from that initial rejection of pleasure that we started with. Let me go on to honor and virtue. In contrast with pleasure and the life of enjoyment, Book One's evaluation of honor as the final end of political life undergoes a different fate as the ethics unfolds. In this case, the initial rejection is not put into question. It is in fact deepened, and it becomes a key to the understanding of moral virtue. This is especially manifest from the role honor plays in the disposition that's presented as the first peak of moral virtue, greatness of soul. Did you get that far? The great-souled man? Megalopsychia in Greek. The great-souled person is someone who stands so far above all the usual petty concerns that he would never be attracted to things that lead others astray. His own sense of dignity and superiority prevents him from even being attracted to anything shameful in regard to any of the passions. Hence, in possessing this one virtue, all the others follow in its wake, or at least the absence of all the vices. Greatness of soul, in Aristotle's words, is a cosmos of the virtues. And cosmos in Greek is either an all-encompassing ordered whole, like the universe, or the crowning jewel that stands above all the others and graces them. Greatness of soul is certainly the least democratic of Aristotle's moral virtues. What the great-souled individual claims and deserves must be the greatest of external goods, and that, Aristotle reasons, should be what we give to the gods, which is honor. But if it is honor that the great-souled individual deserves and demands, he is at his very core caught in a contradiction. The honor that confirms what he is makes him dependent on others, which would be the denial of what he is. If honor were to mean anything to a great-souled person, it would have to come from someone he respects. But he certainly cannot accept a superior, perhaps not even an equal. I think this problem would apply above all to a god. Don't forget Aristotle said what we give to the gods is honor. Greatness of soul displays most vividly the dilemma of honor. And through its status as a peak, according to Aristotle, it suggests that this dilemma might lurk in all of moral virtue. If political life is directed toward honor as its final end, it cannot achieve satisfaction. Aristotle had acknowledged, though, that it is not honor per se, but honor for one's excellence that is desired, which implies that virtue is really the final end of the political life or the active life. You remember it was eliminated on the grounds that it's too incomplete. You can have a virtuous disposition in a state of misfortune, which you wouldn't call happiness. That might seem to apply, though, to any candidate for the human good. Moral virtue, however, makes a special claim to be sufficient. The idea that as long as you have a good soul, as long as you have a good character, nothing else matters. Some of you I know have read through the rest of Book One of the Ethics. As you proceed, that claim is put increasingly into question. Over the course of a lifetime, we are all vulnerable to the wheel of fortune. Even if you don't identify happiness with fortune, it just seems willful to deny that real misfortunes, conditions like chronic illness, poverty, lack of friends or family, inevitably mar our well-being. A virtuous character might shine forth under such circumstances. In fact, maybe the most admirable virtuous character would shine forth under such circumstances. But that's not the same as happiness. Well, what about the activity just in itself of actualizing a virtuous disposition, even if it doesn't make for a lifespan of happiness? Couldn't that count as the final end, which makes the political life best for a human being? The problem here lies in the very ambiguous reference to virtue without any further qualification. For the premise of the ethics' whole investigation of virtue we might want to come back to this issue later too, is its division into two kinds, moral and intellectual, excellence of character and excellence of mind. Book 2 examines how moral virtue is produced and what it is, a disposition that aims at the mean between excess and deficiency in regard to some kind of feeling. The following books explore the whole plurality of virtues and vices that exemplify that definition. Say, courage in regard to fear. Remember, over against cowardice or boldness. Or moderation in regard to the desire for pleasure. Aristotle shows us in these books how the morally virtuous person understands himself as someone who aims at the noble or beautiful for its own sake. Aristotle holds up a mirror that reflects such nobility and why it is admired. But in the process, I think, he quietly points to the limits of these dispositions, the conflicts among them, the confusions we might harbor, the questions one might raise. To home in on what I think might be the most important, can moral virtue aim at the noble or beautiful for its own sake, while being the good that most truly satisfies our interest? Is moral virtue, in fact, the perfection of the whole human being, or the highest in the human being? Questions like that remain underground until the 10th and last book of the Ethics, when it returns to the initial contest of lives. Aristotle had introduced the theoretical life in Book 1 while deferring any comment about it. When he finally gets back to it at the end of Book 10, he asserts, the theoretical life was already said to be the best life for a human being. No, where? Readers are still continuing to search for where he said that. It seems like he's referring back to our Book 1 passage, but in Book 1 he just said, I'll get to it later. When he gets to it, he says, I got to it earlier. Is there some way it may have been established without an explicit statement? Is there a satisfactory argument for it now? My last step, the theoretical life. If happiness is an activity in accordance with virtue, Aristotle reminds his reader in Book 10, it should be in accordance with the most excellent virtue, and that would belong to whatever is best in us. Now, if the human being is a rational animal, what elevates us above all other animals is mind, or intellect, and its activity would be the perfection of the human. That activity must bring the greatest pleasure if, Aristotle remarks in a casual aside, there are such wondrous pleasures even in the pursuit of wisdom, that is, philosophy. That turns out to be a very intricate thing he just did there. We perhaps want to come back to that too. Theoretical activity allows us to be most self-sufficient, even if, Aristotle concedes, it might be a lot better with co-workers than alone. Very hard to sustain it without conversation. Most importantly, the activity of the mind is not pursued for the sake of any other end beyond itself. So, this actualization of the highest human possibility looks as if it does meet the criteria for complete happiness. If, Aristotle suddenly adds, it belongs to a complete span of life. And as soon as he recalls that condition, he admits that such a life would seem to be beyond the merely human. Is this kind of activity going to be so self-sufficient that nothing else matters? He seems to say, I've really built this up and elevated it, but it looks now like it's jumped a step outside of the human range. A human being would live it only insofar as there is something divine in him. But Aristotle urges us not to accept the proverbial advice, he quotes, mortals should think mortal thoughts. No, there are no jealous gods who will punish us for striving to participate as far as possible in a life that is divine. So you seem to now have this idea that the most human is what goes beyond the human. Yet, Aristotle himself seems to raise doubts when he stops one last time to remind us that in matters about how to live, speeches must be considered in light of deeds. We are certainly eager to hear at last the evidence for the identification of happiness with the theoretical life. And let me quote this. He's now going to tell us what's the real evidence, what are the real deeds of life that prove my point. This is what he says. If the gods take care for human things as it is thought, then it would be reasonable to suppose that they enjoy what is best and most akin to themselves, and that would be mind, and that they reward those who honor this most because they care for things dear to themselves and act correctly and beautifully. And this belongs to the wise one, who is therefore most beloved by God and probably most happy. The supposed testimony of deeds is nothing but a common opinion. It is thought to be the case, it would seem likely. And furthermore, an opinion that Aristotle, just a moment before this, had declared ridiculous when he first introduced the thesis about perfect happiness by appealing to the blessed gods. Surely the gods would never need to practice ethical actions like paying back debts justly, facing fears courageously, giving money liberally. If there are living gods, if God is alive, the only suitable activity, and at that moment he turns it into the singular, the only suitable activity for the God is theoria, contemplation. The ethics' final speech on happiness, supported by a rhetorical defense about the gods rewarding us, constructs an image of the theoretical life or the life of contemplation in the sharpest possible separation from the political life or the life of action. He's got them pulled apart as far as he can. The contemplative life he represents by the pre-Socratic philosopher, these first philosophers before Socrates, whose activity of philosophy is solitary contemplation of the universe, of the heavenly bodies. While the statesman who rules the city represents the life of action. So you imagine like the theoretical physicist and the politician. Those are the representatives now of these two competing lives, ways of life. But there's something important, conspicuously missing from that division. What about the activity in which we have been engaged all along in our study of the ethics? Reading the text, thinking it through, discussing with one another the questions it poses, writing exams and papers on it. You see, I'm following Aristotle's advice. He said to us, don't just listen to what someone says, look at what they do. And this is what we've been doing. The speech that identifies the highest human capacity as some kind of theoretical activity does have a real deed that confirms it. Not an opinion about the gods rewarding those most like them, but the deed that we are practicing. This activity might be understood as theoretical. It consists, however, not in solitary contemplation of the universe, but in our shared examination of the opinions about the just, the noble, and the good, the opinions of our society, the assumptions we have been brought up with. This is what Socrates had in mind when he refused at his trial to accept a life of exile or anything that would make him give up the way of life he had always followed. For, as you know, in his famous words, the unexamined life is not worth living. That, I would suggest, is the teaching of Aristotle's ethics. Aristotle shares the most fundamental premise with Plato. All human beings by nature desire the good, desire what is truly good. If we borrow the well-known image Socrates presents in the Republic, every society is a cave. The citizens are chained in front of a wall watching the projected images of the just, the beautiful, and the good, which they take to be the only reality. But every cave has some opening to the light. How does Socrates know that? How does he guarantee that? I want to suggest that opening to the light is guaranteed because we have a knowledge for what is truly good. In this one matter, at least, there is a hunger for truth, and no one would be satisfied with an illusion. You might be satisfied with illusions about the just or illusions about the noble, but you want what's really good. Aristotle set out in the Ethics to discover what is truly good for a human being. He began, though, with a paradoxical invitation that appeared to shut out one kind of reader and make the work superfluous for another. Someone who came to the inquiry with the starting point it requires, opinions about the noble and just that guide moral virtue, if satisfied with that, would seem to have no motivation to open up these pages. Of course, if he did, he might find his own assumptions held up in Aristotle's mirror, perhaps even clarified. The reader, on the other hand, who discovers all the complexities Aristotle unveils, all the implicit questions he raises, that reader who experiences a desire for the why is the one who would be drawn into what I'm calling the deed or the action of the inquiry. You wouldn't be satisfied with the speeches. You would be drawn into the deed. That is the activity of examination, which I believe Aristotle, like Socrates, finds the mark of a life worth living. Thank you.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.